Nobody crosses the dead belt for a stranger unless they've already given up on their own life. The warning echoed through Ethan Cole's cockpit as his cargo shuttle rattled through the frozen storm clouds of Karen 9. Outside the cracked windshield, white static swallowed the horizon in every direction. Ice scraped across the hull like claws against metal. The dashboard glowed red with failing diagnostics. Fuel low. Thermal core unstable. Visibility 0. Ethan leaned forward in his worn pilot seat, gloved hands steady on the controls despite the violent turbulence shaking the ship. Yeah, he muttered to himself, exhaustion rough in his voice. Wouldn't be my first bad decision. The distress signal had appeared 37 minutes earlier. Weak. Fragmented. Buried beneath military scramble frequencies. Most scavengers ignored signals out here. The dead belt was littered with war wreckage and frozen graves from conflicts nobody remembered anymore. But something about this signal bothered him. Maybe it was the repetition. Maybe it was the silence between the bursts. Or maybe Ethan was just tired of pretending he could still ignore people in trouble. The shuttle groaned as landing thrusters fired. Snow exploded across the windshield in white waves before the ship slammed hard against the frozen surface. Ethan grabbed his rifle from the rack beside the hatch, checked the power cell, then pulled on his insulated mask. The rear door hissed open. Instantly, brutal wind tore through the cabin. Minus 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Strong enough to freeze exposed skin in seconds. Ethan stepped into knee-deep snow, boots crunching against hidden ice beneath the surface. The storm screamed around him like a living thing. His helmet light cut through the darkness in narrow flashes. Broken metal jutted from the snow ahead. A wrecked Imperial dropship, nearly split in half. Fresh scorch marks still smoked along the hull. Ethan frowned. Imperial vessels didn't crash out here by accident. His motion scanner suddenly chirped once. Then again. One life sign. Weak. Human instinct tightened his chest before his brain could argue against it. He moved faster, climbing over twisted wreckage until he saw her. For a second, the storm itself seemed to go quiet. The alien woman was pinned against the ruined dropship by a long metallic spear that had punched through part of her armor and lodged into the wall behind her. Snow swirled across silver-blue skin that almost glowed beneath the emergency lights flickering around the wreck. She was enormous compared to him. Easily 7 feet tall, even slumped unconscious against the hull. Dark hair spilled across one shoulder in frozen strands, and strange golden markings shimmered faintly beneath cracked armor plates. Ethan had seen aliens before. Traitors, mercenaries, diplomats, but nothing like this. She looked less like a soldier and more like something carved from another world entirely. His scanner beeped again. Critical condition. Core temperature falling. Ethan exhaled slowly. Hell. He stepped closer carefully. The woman's golden eyes snapped open instantly. Before Ethan could react, a blade of blue energy hissed to life inches from his throat. Even wounded, her hand never shook. Her breathing did, though. Barely controlled. Human, she whispered through clenched teeth. Her voice carried exhaustion and command at the same time. Did they send you to finish it? Ethan stared at the blade near his neck, then at the blood frozen across her armor. Lady, he said quietly, if I wanted you dead, I wouldn't be standing this close. For a moment, neither of them moved. Snow hammered against the wreckage around them, while warning lights blinked weakly through the storm. Then her arm faltered. Just slightly. Enough for Ethan to see the tremor running through her body. The energy blade vanished. Her eyes closed again as her head dropped forward against the metal spear holding her upright. Ethan caught her before she collapsed completely. And that was when his helmet scanner finally identified the crest burned into her armor. Imperial Royal Seal. Level Omega. Ethan's blood ran cold beneath the thermal suit. Oh, he whispered into the storm. You've got to be kidding me. The Imperial crest burned across her armor like a warning from another universe. Ethan stared at it while icy wind whipped snow. Across his visor. Royal Seal. Level Omega. There were only a handful of beings in the entire galaxy authorized to carry that mark, and every single one of them commanded fleets large enough to erase moons from orbit. Fantastic, Ethan muttered under his breath. I finally tried to do something decent, and it turns out to be political. The woman shifted weakly against the wreckage. Frost clung to her dark lashes as her breathing grew shallower. Ethan checked the thermal reading on his wrist display and felt his stomach tighten. Her body temperature was dropping too fast. Another 20 minutes out here, and she would not survive the storm. He looked back toward his shuttle parked nearly half a mile away through the whiteout. Then he looked at the spear pinning her to the wall. It was not an ordinary weapon. The shaft pulsed with faint blue light, humming softly beneath layers of ice. Ethan recognized military tech when he saw it. Containment spear, designed to immobilize high-value targets without killing them. Whoever attacked her had wanted her alive long enough to suffer through the cold. People really are awful everywhere, he said quietly. Golden eyes opened again. Tired. Sharp. Dangerous even now. You speak too much, human. Ethan crouched beside her, gripping the frozen spear carefully with both gloved hands. And you are bleeding on my boots. We all have flaws. Her expression barely changed, but something flickered there for half a second. Not amusement exactly. More like confusion at being spoken to normally. Do not remove it, she warned weakly. The spear stabilizes the wound. Ethan paused. Good to know before I yank on it. Snow rattled against the broken dropship around them, while warning sirens echoed faintly from somewhere deeper inside the wreck. The storm was getting worse. Ethan scanned the surrounding cliffs with narrowed eyes. No movement yet, but nobody left an Imperial Royal to freeze in the middle of nowhere without planning to come back. He unclipped a thermal blanket from his pack and wrapped it around her shoulders first. The fabric hissed softly as built-in heating coils activated. The alien woman stiffened immediately. Why she? Asked. Ethan frowned. Why what? Why preserve my life? Her voice sounded genuinely uncertain now, like the answer mattered more than the freezing storm around them. Ethan leaned back slightly, snow gathering across his armor plates. Because you are hurt. That is not an answer. It is for humans. For a long moment, she simply stared at him. Wind screamed through the shattered hull above them. Somewhere far overhead, thunder rolled beneath thick clouds glowing faint blue from electrical storms. Finally, she spoke again, quieter this time. Humans are stranger than the stories claim. Ethan gave a tired shrug. Depends on the human. He stood and moved behind the containment spear, bracing one boot against twisted metal. Warning indicators flashed across his visor as he activated the servo assist in his exosuit. This is probably going to hurt, he admitted. Her jaw tightened. I have endured worse. Yeah, royalty always says that right before passing out. Ethan pulled hard. The spear released with a sharp metallic crack, sending vibrations through the wreckage. The alien woman gasped softly as the weapon came free, her body collapsing forward instantly. Ethan caught her against his chest before she hit the snow. Up close, she felt frighteningly cold even through his insulated armor. Her silver-blue skin shimmered faintly beneath the storm light, almost unreal against the darkness. Ethan adjusted her weight carefully across his shoulders and started toward the shuttle. The wind pushed against him hard enough to steal his breath. Each step sank deep into the frozen snow. Behind him, the ruined dropship groaned beneath the storm. Ahead, visibility disappeared into white nothingness. Then his motion scanner suddenly chirped. Once, twice. Multiple signals approaching fast through the blizzard. Ethan stopped walking. A distorted transmission crackled across an open military frequency inside his helmet. Imperial Retrieval Squad entering sector. Priority target must not escape. Ethan looked down at the unconscious woman in his arms, then at the growing red dots appearing on his scanner through the storm. Well, he sighed heavily. This day just keeps getting better. Ethan pushed through the storm with the alien woman draped across his shoulders while the motion tracker inside his visor blinked faster every second. 3 signals, then 5, closing in from the eastern ridge. Snow hammered against his armor hard enough to rattle the plating across his chest. The wind carried distant engine noise now. Small aircraft. Fast. Military. You are slowing down, the woman murmured weakly against his shoulder. Ethan almost laughed. That is your professional opinion? Her breathing sounded shallow beneath the thermal blanket wrapped around her body. Even unconscious half the time, she still spoke like someone used to giving orders to entire armies. Ethan adjusted his grip and kept moving through knee-deep snow toward the faint outline of his shuttle barely visible through the blizzard. The engines were still warm. If he could reach it before the retrieval squad locked onto his position, they had a chance. Maybe. His boots slipped against hidden ice, nearly sending both of them crashing sideways. The woman's hand suddenly grabbed the front of his jacket with surprising strength. "Leave me," she whispered again. "The Empire does not forgive interference." Ethan kept walking. "Good thing I stopped asking governments for permission years ago." Another pulse echoed through his scanner. Closer now. Ethan looked back over his shoulder. Blue searchlights flickered faintly between the cliffs behind them, cutting through the storm like knives. They were being tracked. His jaw tightened beneath the mask. "Fantastic." The woman stirred slightly against him. "You joke in dangerous moments." Keeps me from screaming. The shuttle finally emerged through the whiteout ahead, half buried beneath drifting snow. Ethan hit the remote release on his wrist console. The cargo ramp lowered slowly with a hydraulic groan. Warm light spilled onto the frozen ground below. Ethan climbed inside quickly and sealed the hatch behind them just as another blast of icy wind slammed against the hull. Silence rushed over him instantly. The sudden quiet made his ears ring. He lowered the woman carefully onto a padded bench near the rear medical locker. Frost still covered parts of her armor. Meltwater dripped softly onto the steel floor beneath her. Up close, she looked even worse than before, pale beneath the silver-blue glow of her skin. Exhausted, her breathing uneven. Ethan pulled off one glove and reached for the portable scanner mounted inside the med kit. The device hummed softly as it passed over her injuries. Multiple fractures, severe blood loss, hypothermia, internal stress indicators flashing dangerously across the display in symbols Ethan barely recognized. "You should already be dead," he muttered quietly. Her golden eyes open halfway. That would disappoint many people. Ethan glanced at her while digging through the locker for thermal injectors. "You always talk like a prophecy?" "I speak plainly." That must be exhausting for everybody else. For the first time, he noticed the faintest change in her expression. Tiny, almost invisible, but definitely there. Not anger, not suspicion, something warmer, softer, like she had forgotten how to react to ordinary conversation. Ethan loaded the injector and hesitated. "This might sting. You continue warning me as if I frighten easily." "Lady, I do not even know your name." She studied him silently for several seconds while storm winds rattled the hull outside. Then, finally, she spoke. "Veilira." Ethan froze slightly at the sound of it. Even he recognized the name. Everybody in the outer systems did. Veilira, the Iron Empress, ruler of the 5 worlds' dominion. The woman entire fleets feared. Ethan stared at her while realization settled heavily into the shuttle cabin. "No," he said quietly. "No chance." Veilira's eyes never left his face. "You know who I am." Ethan gave a slow, disbelieving laugh under his breath. "Lady, if you are really Empress Veilira, then half the galaxy is probably looking for this shuttle right now." Before she could answer, the cockpit alarms suddenly screamed to life. "Warning! Multiple target locks detected." Ethan spun toward the forward display as bright blue lights appeared beyond the storm outside. 6 Imperial interceptors descended through the clouds in perfect formation, engines glowing against the darkness like falling stars. The shuttle's cabin went silent except for the alarm. Veilira closed her eyes briefly. "They found us." Ethan stared at the approaching warships through the iced windshield. Then he looked back at the exhausted woman sitting alone beneath flickering cabin lights. "Yeah," he said quietly while reaching for the controls. "And somehow I think they are not here to rescue you." The 6 Imperial interceptors hovered beyond the storm like predators circling wounded prey. Their engines glowed through the blizzard in cold blue pulses that washed across Ethan's cockpit windows every few seconds. The alarms inside the shuttle continued screaming. Target lock detected. Ethan dropped into the pilot seat and powered up the engines anyway. The old cargo shuttle groaned beneath him, lights flickering weakly across the dashboard. "Come on," he muttered, slamming one hand against the console. "Do not embarrass me now." Behind him, Veilira sat motionless beneath the thermal blanket, one hand pressed against her side while snowmelt dripped quietly onto the metal floor. Even exhausted, there was something unnervingly composed about her, like she had spent her entire life surrounded by chaos and simply learned to sit still inside it. Ethan checked the fuel reserves. 22%. Not enough for a prolonged escape. Not enough for a fight either. One interceptor alone could vaporize a scavenger shuttle like his without effort. 6 of them meant somebody wanted certainty. You should surrender me, Veolyra said softly from behind him. Ethan did not turn around. You keep offering that like it is helpful. It is logical. That usually means it is a terrible idea. Outside, one of the interceptors drifted lower through the storm until its massive silhouette became visible beyond the iced windshield. Smooth black armor. Imperial insignia burned into the hull in silver light. Ethan's communicator suddenly crackled. Unidentified scavenger vessel, a cold mechanical voice announced. Power down your engines immediately and prepare for Imperial inspection. Ethan leaned back slowly in his seat. See? They even said please. Veolyra's eyes narrowed faintly. Those are not my guard divisions. Ethan looked over his shoulder. You can tell from the voice? From the formation. Ethan glanced back toward the ships hovering outside. Perfect spacing. Identical movement. Not military discipline. Something more controlled. More surgical. Veolyra's expression darkened slightly beneath the cabin lights. These soldiers were sent to erase evidence. The sentence settled heavily into the shuttle. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before turning back toward the cockpit glass. Meaning, she said quietly. If they discover I survived, they will destroy this moon to conceal their failure. Ethan stared at the storm outside while that sank in. Then he rubbed one tired hand across his face. I knew I should have ignored that distress signal. A faint sound escaped Veolyra then. Small, barely audible beneath the alarms. Ethan realized a second later that she had laughed. Not loudly, not warmly. More like somebody remembering how after years without reason to. Human, she murmured. You complain constantly for someone still trying to save me. Ethan snorted softly. That is because humans evolved under stress. The communicator crackled again, harsher this time. Final warning. Disable engines immediately. Ethan's eyes moved across the console rapidly. Navigation offline. Long-range thrusters unstable. Weapons system almost non-existent. Then he noticed something blinking on the lower display. Emergency mining tunnels beneath the glacier field. Old extraction routes cut directly through the mountains decades ago. Too narrow for interceptors. Too unstable for large ships. Exactly the kind of place desperate people used. Ethan's hand moved toward the controls. Tell me something honestly, he said quietly. Veolyra watched him carefully. What? If these people catch us, how bad does this become? Silence lingered for 2 long seconds while blue searchlights swept across the shuttle hull outside. Then Veolyra answered. Entire worlds would burn to hide this betrayal. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Right. No pressure. The interceptor outside suddenly powered its weapons. Blue light flooded the storm. Ethan grabbed the controls. Instantly. Hold on. The shuttle engines roared awake with violent force, shaking the entire cabin as Ethan slammed power into the thrusters. Snow exploded behind them while the cargo vessel surged sideways across the frozen surface just as a blast of light struck the ground where they had been seconds earlier. Warning sirens screamed louder. The shuttle rattled violently through the storm toward the glacier cliffs ahead. Veolyra grabbed the side rail to steady herself, while Ethan wrestled the controls with both hands. Human, she said sharply over the noise. Those tunnels collapsed years ago. Ethan grinned tiredly beneath the cockpit lights while ice and snow hammered against the windshield. Then this is going to be exciting. The cargo shuttle plunged toward the glacier cliffs while warning sirens echoed through the cockpit in frantic bursts of red light. Ice and snow hammered the hull hard enough to shake loose frost from the ceiling panels above Ethan's head. Behind them, 6 Imperial interceptors cut through the storm in perfect formation, their searchlights slicing across the darkness like pale blue blades. Ethan gripped the controls tighter as the entrance to the abandoned mining tunnel appeared ahead through the whiteout. Narrow, jagged, barely wider than the shuttle itself. This is a terrible plan, Veolyra said from behind him. One hand braced against the cabin wall as turbulence rattled the ship violently. Ethan did not look away from the tunnel entrance. You keep saying things I already know. Then perhaps you should begin making better decisions. That sounds expensive. The shuttle screamed through the opening barely 30 feet above the frozen ground. Metal scraped violently against rock as Ethan angled the ship sideways through the collapsing tunnel entrance. The cockpit lights flickered. One of the rear stabilizers sparked hard enough to fill the cabin with the sharp smell of burnt circuitry. Then darkness swallowed them completely. The storm vanished behind solid ice walls. Only the shuttle headlights remained, illuminating ancient mining tracks buried beneath decades of frost. Ethan exhaled slowly for the first time in minutes. "See," he muttered. "Perfectly safe." Veilira stared at him like he had completely lost his mind. "Humans survive entirely through recklessness." "That is not true," Ethan replied. "Sometimes we survive through caffeine." Behind them, the tunnel entrance exploded briefly with blue light as the interceptors attempted to follow. The entire glacier shook. Snow and chunks of ice rained from the ceiling overhead. Ethan pushed the shuttle deeper into the tunnel system while the engine temperature climbed dangerously high across his display. Finally, after another mile of winding darkness, he spotted an old maintenance chamber carved directly into the glacier wall. He guided the damaged shuttle inside carefully and powered down the engines. Silence settled over the cabin almost immediately. No alarms. No gunfire. Just the soft ticking sound of overheated metal cooling in the frozen air. Ethan leaned back in his seat with tired eyes. "Okay," he breathed. "That officially counts as one of my worst days." Behind him, Veilira lowered herself carefully onto the side bench again. The thermal blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, though parts of her armor had begun freezing over once more in the cold chamber air. Ethan grabbed a portable heater from the emergency locker and activated it near her feet. Warm orange light flickered softly across the cabin walls. Veilira watched him quietly for several seconds. "You continue helping me," she said at last. "Even after learning who I am." Ethan pulled off one glove and rubbed warmth back into his hand. "Should I stop?" "Most would. Most people are disappointing." Her golden eyes followed him carefully while he checked the shuttle systems. Outside the iced-over side window, snow drifted silently through cracks in the frozen tunnel ceiling. The galaxy suddenly felt very far away down here. Veilira's voice softened slightly. "Do humans always speak this casually to rulers?" Ethan snorted quietly while reconnecting a damaged power cable beneath the console. "Lady, I used to haul mining equipment to colonies where governors drank beer with mechanics. You stop being impressed by important people after a while. I am not merely important." Ethan finally looked back at her then. Pale silver-blue skin beneath the heater glow. Exhaustion hidden behind discipline. A woman feared by entire star systems sitting injured inside a broken cargo shuttle buried beneath a glacier. "No," he admitted quietly. "You are probably the scariest person I have ever met." Veilira tilted her head slightly. "Yet you are not afraid of me." Ethan thought about that for a moment while the heater crackled softly between them. Then he shrugged. "Honestly, you look more tired than dangerous right now." Something changed in her expression again. Small, almost invisible. But this time Ethan recognized it immediately. Sadness. Deep enough to make somebody quiet instead of emotional. Veilira lowered her gaze toward the heater flames. "Nobody has spoken to me like this in many years." Ethan looked down at the tools in his hands. "Yeah," he said softly. "That probably says more about your empire than it does about me." Neither of them spoke after that. The old heater hummed between them while snow drifted silently through the frozen darkness outside. And somewhere far above the glacier, Imperial ships continued searching the storm for a wounded Empress who, for the first time in a very long time, was no longer alone. The heater's orange glow flickered softly across the frozen maintenance chamber while Ethan worked beneath an open wall panel beside the shuttle. Old wires hung from the exposed circuitry like frozen veins. His gloves rested nearby on the metal floor while his bare hands tightened a cracked coolant valve with slow, careful movements. The chamber smelled faintly of ozone, engine oil, and melting ice. Somewhere deeper in the glacier, old support beams groaned beneath shifting pressure from the storm above. Veilira watched him silently from the shuttle doorway. The thermal blanket still draped around her shoulders, though she now stood upright despite the pain clearly visible beneath her calm expression. Ethan noticed immediately. "That is a terrible idea," he said without looking up. "You should be resting." "I have rested enough." That sentence usually comes right before somebody collapses dramatically. Veilira ignored the comment and stepped farther into the chamber. The silver-blue markings beneath her skin shimmered faintly in the heater light. Ethan had assumed they were decorative before. Now he realized they pulsed slightly whenever she moved, almost like living circuitry beneath the surface. Alien biology never stopped being unsettling up close. You repair machinery yourself, she observed quietly. Ethan tightened another bolt before answering. Used to repair mining crawlers on Europa stations when I was 19. You were trained as an engineer? Ethan gave a short laugh. No, I was trained as poor. Veolyra tilted her head slightly at that. Ethan finally looked up long enough to notice the confusion in her golden eyes. Humans fix things when they cannot afford replacements, he explained. Machines. Homes. Sometimes each other. Silence settled briefly between them while snow drifted softly through cracks in the frozen ceiling overhead. Then Veolyra spoke again. In the Dominion, nobody repairs Imperial equipment personally. That sounds exhausting. It is efficient. Ethan snorted softly and returned to the damaged coolant system. Efficiency is overrated. Veolyra watched him for another long moment before speaking in a quieter voice. You continue speaking to me as if I am ordinary. Ethan paused. The wrench in his hand rested motionless against the pipe. Lady, he said carefully, right now you are standing barefoot inside an abandoned ice tunnel wrapped in one of my emergency blankets while people try to kill both of us. He glanced up at her tired expression beneath the dim light. That feels pretty ordinary by frontier standards. Something about the answer seemed to disarm her more than any weapon could have. Veolyra lowered herself slowly onto an old cargo crate near the heater. For the first time since Ethan found her in the storm, she looked less like an Empress and more like somebody carrying unbearable exhaustion for too long. When I was young, she said quietly, my tutors taught that rulers must remain above attachment. Compassion clouds judgment. Familiarity weakens authority. Ethan listened without interrupting while reconnecting another frozen cable. The first lesson I learned as a child, she continued, was that fear preserves order better than kindness. Ethan leaned back against the wall panel thoughtfully. And do you believe that? Veolyra stared into the heater flames for several seconds before answering. I believed it yesterday. The words hung in the frozen chamber longer than either of them expected. Then suddenly the shuttle's communication console crackled to life behind them. Both turned instantly toward the cockpit. Static hissed through the speakers before a distorted transmission forced its way onto the open channel. Attention, all Imperial units. Priority command issued by Regent Malrek. Veolyra went completely still beside the heater. The voice that followed was calm. Cold. Male. The traitor responsible for the attack on the throne has fled with human assistance. All survivors are to be terminated immediately. Ethan frowned slightly. Regent. Veolyra's face had become unreadable again. Hard. Controlled. Dangerous. Malrek is my younger brother, she said softly, and he has just declared himself ruler of the Dominion. The transmission continued through layers of static. Effective immediately, Empress Veolyra has been charged with crimes against the 5 worlds and sentenced in absentia. Ethan stared at the speaker. Well, he muttered slowly, that feels politically unhealthy. But Veolyra was no longer listening. Her eyes remained fixed on the frozen floor, while something deeper than anger settled across her expression. Betrayal. Not loud. Not explosive. Just heavy enough to hollow somebody from the inside. Ethan watched her carefully for a moment before quietly setting his tools aside. Then he walked over and placed a steaming metal cup beside her without saying anything. Veolyra looked down at it in confusion. What is this? Coffee. What does it do? Ethan sat down across from her while the heater hummed softly between them. Honestly, he said tiredly, mostly keeps humans emotionally functional. For the first time since the transmission ended, Veolyra's shoulders eased slightly beneath the blanket. And somewhere far above the glacier, the empire she once ruled was already hunting her like a ghost. The glacier trembled again sometime later. Not from the storm this time. Ethan felt the vibration through the metal floor beneath his boots while he stood inside the cockpit, studying the damaged sensor array. Tiny flakes of frost drifted from the ceiling panels with every distant impact above them. Someone was scanning the ice field. Methodically, patiently. That cannot be good, he murmured. Behind him, Veolyra remained seated beside the heater, though the exhaustion in her posture had changed into something colder now. More focused. More dangerous. The transmission from her brother still echoed faintly in Ethan's memory. Traitor. Sentenced. Terminated immediately. It sounded less like politics and more like a funeral announcement delivered early. Ethan tapped the scanner again. Static danced across the cracked display before finally resolving into several moving heat signatures above the tunnel network. Search teams. Closing slowly. They are mapping the glacier, Veolyra said quietly. Ethan glanced back at her. You can tell from vibrations? Imperial hunter units use synchronized drilling pulses. She lifted her eyes toward the frozen ceiling overhead. Malrek was always thorough. Ethan leaned against the console with folded arms. Your brother sounds unpleasant. Veolyra did not answer immediately. The heater cast soft gold across her silver-blue skin while shadows moved slowly through the maintenance chamber around them. When we were children, she said at last. He used to follow me through the palace gardens carrying wooden training swords. He hated losing to me. Ethan listened silently while adjusting the charge pack on his pulse rifle. My father admired strength above all else, she continued. Malrek learned quickly that kindness earned nothing in our family. Ethan gave a tired half-smile. Yeah, humans usually need at least one terrible parent before becoming emotionally damaged. That earned the smallest flicker of amusement from her again. Tiny, brief, but real. Then another vibration rolled through the glacier, stronger this time. Dust and frost cascaded from the ceiling near the tunnel entrance. Ethan's expression hardened immediately. Okay, he muttered, grabbing the rifle from the wall rack. That one sounded personal. The shuttle scanner suddenly burst alive with warning tones. Multiple life signs detected. Distance, 400 yards. Ethan moved toward the narrow side window carved into the ice wall and wiped frost away with his sleeve. Blue lights moved through the distant tunnel system ahead. Slow. Searching. They found the outer shafts already, he said quietly. Veolyra stood carefully despite the pain still visible in her movements. You must leave. Ethan did not look away from the approaching lights. We already had this conversation. This is no longer survival, human. Her voice sharpened slightly. You owe me nothing. Ethan checked the rifle charge level calmly. 34%. Barely enough for emergencies. You know, he said softly. People keep telling me that. Veolyra stepped closer through the dim heater glow. If they discover you protected me willingly, every system aligned with the Dominion will hunt you. Ethan shrugged inside his worn jacket. Would not be the first government unhappy with me. You joke because you fear consequences. Ethan finally turned toward her then. The heater flickered between them while distant drilling pulses echoed faintly through the glacier walls. No, he said quietly. I joke because if I stop, this entire situation becomes terrifying. Veolyra stared at him for a long moment after that. Then her eyes lowered briefly toward the rifle in his hands. That weapon will not stop Imperial hunters. Ethan checked the power cell anyway. Probably not. Then why stand and fight? Ethan looked toward the frozen tunnel entrance where pale blue searchlights now moved closer through drifting snow and darkness. Then he answered with the same calm voice he used for everything else. Because nobody should face betrayal alone. Silence settled heavily between them. Veolyra's expression changed again then. Not surprise this time. Not confusion either. Something deeper. Like a wall inside her had cracked quietly without permission. The scanner alarm suddenly screamed again. Distance, 200 yards. Ethan stepped forward and sealed the maintenance chamber blast door manually. Thick steel groaned shut across the tunnel entrance while emergency locks engaged one by one. Outside, faint voices echoed through the ice. Closer now. Hunting. Ethan exhaled slowly and rested one hand against the rifle. Well, he muttered beneath the flickering lights. Looks like diplomacy officially failed. Veolyra watched him from across the heater glow while the old chamber trembled around them. And for the first time in years, the Empress of Five Worlds looked at someone not as a subject or soldier or rival, but as a man stubborn enough to stand beside her when entire worlds had chosen not to. The first impact against the blast door sounded like the glacier itself cracking apart. Metal groaned violently through the maintenance chamber while frost exploded from the ceiling in white clouds. Ethan tightened his grip on the pulse rifle and instinctively stepped in front of Veolyra. The heater behind them flickered weakly now, casting nervous shadows across the frozen walls. Another impact shook the chamber harder. Then came silence. Not peaceful silence. The kind that waited before something terrible happened. Ethan's scanner blinked red beside the shuttle controls. 12 life signs outside the chamber. Organized. Patient. They know we are trapped, Veilira said quietly. Ethan kept his eyes on the blast door. Yeah, I got that part. A distorted voice echoed through the tunnel speakers beyond the steel barrier. Calm. Controlled. Your Majesty, the voice called. This does not need to continue. Veilira's entire expression hardened instantly at the sound. Ethan glanced toward her. That him? She nodded once. Malrek. The voice returned through the ice-covered speakers. The Dominion mourns your tragic death already. Do not force me to damage your legacy further. Ethan frowned slightly. Your brother sounds like a corporate lawyer. Veilira ignored the comment, stepping slowly toward the blast door despite her injuries. You sent hunters instead of soldiers, she said coldly. You feared they would remain loyal to me. Soft laughter echoed through the tunnel beyond the door. Loyalty follows power, sister. You taught me that yourself. Ethan watched Veilira carefully then, not as an empress, not even as a ruler, just as someone listening to the voice of a person who once mattered to her. There was no rage in her face. Somehow that made it worse. Malrek continued speaking. Open the chamber. I will allow the human to leave alive. Ethan immediately shook his head. That offer feels suspiciously temporary. Veilira's golden eyes remained fixed on the frozen steel door. You murdered our council. I preserved the empire, Malrek replied smoothly. You weakened it with mercy. Silence followed. Ethan could almost hear the old wounds beneath their words. Family history carved into politics sharp enough to destroy worlds. Then Malrek spoke again, quieter this time. You always believed compassion made you stronger. A faint drilling sound started somewhere outside the chamber walls. Cutting equipment. Ethan checked the rifle charge. 21% remaining. Unfortunately, Malrek continued, history will remember that it made you vulnerable. The chamber lights suddenly dimmed. Power fluctuations rippled through the tunnel system around them. Ethan moved toward the failing generator instinctively, but Veilira's hand caught his wrist gently before he reached it. Stop. Ethan looked back at her. The heater glow reflected in her golden eyes now, but something inside them had changed completely. Not fear, not exhaustion, resolution. What? He asked quietly. Veilira released his wrist slowly. My brother believes power comes from fear because that is all our empire ever taught us. Another impact slammed against the blast door hard enough to bend the steel inward slightly. Sparks burst from the control panel beside it. Outside, drilling tools whined louder. Ethan raised the rifle anyway. You got a better plan? Veilira stepped past him then. Slow. Steady. The thermal blanket slipped from her shoulders and fell quietly onto the frozen floor behind her. Silver blue markings beneath her skin began glowing brighter, now beneath the failing lights. Not softly anymore. Brilliant. Alive. Ethan stared in disbelief, as the air itself seemed to shift around her. Veilira. She turned toward him for the first time since the hunters arrived. And suddenly Ethan understood something terrifying. Until now, he had only met the wounded woman beneath the crown. He had never truly stood in the presence of the ruler who commanded 5 worlds. You showed me something impossible, Ethan Cole, she said softly over the trembling chamber. A person who protects others without demanding power in return. Another impact shook the room. The blast door buckled inward further. My people forgot what strength truly looks like. The lights overhead exploded in showers of sparks. Then Veilira straightened fully, silver blue light illuminating the chamber around her like dawn breaking through ice. Now, she said quietly, they are going to remember. Before Ethan could answer, every ship above the glacier suddenly vanished from his scanner at once. The chamber fell silent, completely silent. Then, far above the frozen moon, something enormous moved through the storm clouds. Everything above the glacier went silent. No engines, no drilling equipment, no transmission chatter. Ethan stared at the frozen scanner in disbelief while the maintenance chamber trembled softly around them. Every hostile signal had disappeared at once. Then the tunnel walls themselves began glowing faint blue beneath the ice. Veilira stood motionless in the center of the chamber, silver light flowing beneath her skin like living starlight. The air around her felt heavier now, charged with something ancient and immense that Ethan could not explain. Outside the blast door, distant footsteps suddenly stopped. Complete silence followed. Then a new transmission crackled through the chamber speakers. Not distorted this time. Clear. Respectful. Terrified. Your Majesty, an unfamiliar voice said carefully. The First Fleet has arrived. Ethan blinked once. First Fleet. The glacier above them groaned like a mountain shifting in its sleep. Veolyra stepped toward the sealed blast door slowly, her expression calm again. Controlled. Imperial. Open the channel, she commanded. Instantly, the chamber speakers activated fully. Hundreds of voices flooded through at once before falling silent again the second she inhaled. Ethan felt it then. Not fear exactly. Authority. The kind powerful enough to quiet entire armies without raising its voice. Veolyra's eyes lifted toward the ceiling as though she could see through miles of ice and storm above them. This is Veolyra of the Five Worlds Dominion, she said evenly. Stand down immediately. Silence followed for one long heartbeat. Then another voice answered through the speakers. Shaken. Emotional. By the stars. Ethan frowned as recognition spread through the transmissions outside. Soldiers speaking over one another. Confusion turning into disbelief. Somewhere beyond the glacier, entire fleets were realizing their Empress still lived. Malrek's voice finally returned, colder now. Less confident than before. You survived because I underestimated sentiment. Veolyra's expression never changed. No, she replied softly. You failed because you underestimated humanity. Ethan looked at her sharply after that. Veolyra did not turn toward him, but he saw the faintest shift at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. Something quieter. The blast door locks suddenly disengaged one by one with heavy metallic clunks. Outside the chamber, blue searchlights vanished as armored hunter units slowly lowered their weapons. Ethan exhaled carefully and lowered his rifle for the first time in hours. Well, he muttered under his breath. That escalated politically. Moments later, the glacier ceiling above them split open with a deep, thunderous sound. White storm light flooded the maintenance chamber as massive silhouettes descended through the falling snow outside. Imperial carriers. Dozens of them. Their silver hulls stretched across the sky like moving cities beneath the storm clouds. Ethan stepped slowly beside Veolyra at the chamber entrance, while frozen wind rushed through the tunnel around them. Then he saw it. Thousands of Imperial soldiers kneeling simultaneously across the glacier surface beneath the hovering fleets. Entire armies bowing their heads toward the woman beside him. Not out of fear. Loyalty. Veolyra stood silently in the blowing snow while silver-blue light reflected across the ice around her. The exhausted, wounded woman Ethan carried through the storm was gone now. In her place stood the ruler of 5 worlds. Yet when she looked at Ethan again, the warmth in her eyes remained. Days later, after the fleets departed and the Dominion reclaimed its throne, Ethan returned to his old life on the frontier moon stations. His shuttle still rattled. His heater still failed every other morning. And the galaxy still felt too large most days. Then one evening, while snow drifted quietly beyond his workshop windows, a single Imperial ship descended from the clouds outside his station. No soldiers emerged. No guards. Just Veolyra herself stepping slowly through the falling snow, wearing a dark travel cloak instead of royal armor. Ethan leaned against the workshop doorway in disbelief. You know, he said carefully, normal people usually send thank you messages. Veolyra stopped a few feet away, snow gathering softly across her silver hair. In my empire, she replied quietly, we honor the people who remind us what we were supposed to become. Ethan looked at her for a moment while cold wind moved silently through the station lights around them. Then his eyes dropped toward the familiar thermal blanket folded carefully in her hands. The same one he wrapped around her inside the storm. Veolyra noticed his expression and held the blanket slightly closer against the cold. I believe, she said softly, this belongs to you. Somewhere above them, stars burned quietly beyond the winter clouds. And for the first time in many years, the most powerful woman in the galaxy stood beside someone who saw her not as a throne, not as a weapon, but simply as a person worth carrying through the storm.